Hey everybody, today is Monday, April 5th, 2021. Coming up on today's show, from Zack Snyder's Justice League, editor David Brenner.
If you know in the back of your mind that the studio will want a movie that's not over 2.5 hours, and then you're watching something that's well over 4 hours, you know you have your work cut out for you.
Editor DODY DORN.
The fact that it was streaming did allow for a lot of flexibility, both in fleshing out the characters and their backstories and not worrying, frankly, about runtime.
And editor Carlos Castillón.
The initial Snyder Cut was just meant for Zack to have a cut of the movie that he can watch and he can show his friends.
All that and a lot more on this episode of The Rough Cut. Okay, welcome to your weekly exploration into the art and science of film and TV post-production. I have to admit, I had this one circled on the calendar for a while, ever since it was announced that there would be, in fact, a Snyder Cut. And whether or not you're a fan of the DC universe or even these kind of superhero movies in general, that doesn't so much matter because this is a really unique scenario and a great case study for anyone interested in post-production, which, I am. And there's probably a pretty good chance that you are too. Unless you're a DC fan just here to get some inside-the-scenes stuff, which is cool too. I think you'll get some of what you're looking for. But most of all, I hope you come to understand what a critical and often underappreciated role the editors play in crafting the story and being more or less the hub of the filmmaking process. So who are the editors we should be meeting and appreciating today? Well, we'll start with David Brenner. David began his career as a frequent collaborator with director Oliver Stone, cutting such films as Talk Radio, The Doors, and Born on the 4th of July, for which he won an Oscar with co-editor Joe Hutching. But in more recent years, it's been Zack Snyder at the helm of David's films. The two collaborated on Men of Steel, 300 Rise of an Empire, Batman vs. Superman Dawn of Justice, and then the theatrical cut of Justice League up until Zack left the project to be with his family. At the time when Zack Snyder learned that HBO Max would give him the opportunity to realize the initial vision of his film, he was working on Army of the Dead with editor DODY DORN. And if anyone knows how to work through a complex edit, it would be DODY. Among her many accomplishments, she was nominated for an Oscar for cutting Christopher Nolan's Memento, which, if you've seen it, has quite the nonlinear structure. So it certainly made sense for Zack to ask DODY to lend her considerable storytelling skills to the work that David had begun. And last but definitely not least is Carlos Castillón. Carlos not only assisted DODY on Army of the Dead, but also David on the theatrical cut of Justice League. On top of that, Carlos played a huge role not only as the link between the work of David and DODY, but also working closely with Zack to bring his earlier cuts with David back to life so that he and DODY could complete the mission. So like I said, this is a big movie and not just in runtime. It required a massive amount of work and navigating all the obstacles that stood in the way of fully realizing the, quote, Snyder Cut of Justice League. Also part of that work was bringing back the score of composer Tom Holkenborg, known to one and all as Junkie XL. His score for the theatrical cut was dropped and then resurrected for the Snyder Cut. And I know what you're thinking, there has to be an easier way to work with Junkie XL. Good news, there is, with Extreme Music. Yes, I know you saw that one coming. For over 20 years, they have been providing filmmakers and artists just like you with the best in production audio, created by multi-award-winning musicians, composers, and the like. Yes, not only Junkie XL, but also big names like Hans Zimmer, Trent Reznor, Quincy Jones, and other top-shelf artists. So you just go to their website, sign up for a free account, and do a keyword search on tempo, lyrics, genre, instrumentation. It's really fun and really simple to do, all online, or they can personally lend a hand from one of their many, many worldwide offices. You get your tracks served up just how you want them, right down to the stems, so you can dial up exactly what your project needs. So visit our friends at Extreme Music who helped to bring you this podcast and make your story sound its very best. All right, you waited years for the film. Let's not wait any longer for the podcast. From Zack Snyder's Justice League, here are David Brenner, DODY DORN, and Carlos Castillón.
I'm something from like the tunnel battle.
Yeah, the tunnel battle, exactly.
That would be awesome.
Mixdowns on top of mixdowns. It's all just great.
There's so many different ways we could take this story. It is truly unique in a lot of aspects. What I thought we would do, since we are talking about a superhero movie, is do some origin stories. David, I thought we would start with you, because I think maybe you might have the longest history with this project. Tell me a little bit about how you got attached to what eventually became Zack Snyder's Justice League.
Well, I had worked for Zack since Man of Steel. I'd met him before that, interviewed for that movie, and we got along well. So I worked on Man of Steel and then its sequel, Batman vs. Superman. And then we helped along the 300 sequel, 300 Rise of an Empire. So I ended up doing a lot of cutting on that. And then there was Justice League. I remember I came out to London to start Justice League, and kind of when we got there, we found out that they were pushing production because they had some script issues, which had to do with the studio wanting to change some stuff kind of at the last minute. So we ended up coming back here, and I forgot, Carlos, how long it was delayed, but then we started. And then I just was the editor as you would be on any normal film. I was there for most of the shooting, except for my mom had cancer. And so I wanted to be with her here. So I spent maybe a third of the production period just editing remotely. And Carlos was in London, and I had Abbott here, and it was one of the remote systems that I had kind of adapted from Michael Bay's system. It was something that Roger Barton had created, kind of became Evercast. So then after my mom passed away, after a while, I went to London, and then we finished the film, came back to Burbank, and it was the normal kind of process where you have some time to work on your assembly, and then you watch the assembly. I mean, Zack had seen probably 80% of the material just by, on the set, I would give him what I was doing on his iPad. So nothing kind of was a surprise to him. When it was time to watch the assembly, Zack is one of the directors that likes to sit down and watch a whole thing. A lot of directors, they don't want to do that. They want to go reel by reel so that you're not overwhelmed by all the problems kind of adding up and cumulatively making you want to jump off a bridge. Zack's happy to watch a cut that's well over 4 hours, and our first assembly was well over 4 hours. So, and then we started the normal director's cut process.
Okay, Carlos, David teed up a few for you there. Tell me a little bit about you joining the team and also some of the things that David brought up in terms of assembly and process.
I got involved with the team on Man of Steel. That's when David brought me on. And then from Man of Steel, we went right on to, like he said, right on to 300. And then at that point, the movies kind of started overlapping. So like we were doing prep for Batman, Superman while we were finishing 300. And then there was some time off in between. Then we went right back into Batman, Superman. And then I think it was like we were finished with the theatrical cut. We were doing the ultimate cut. And then we started prepping for Justice League. And that was in 2015, I want to say, November of 2015. And then we started shooting. We were supposed to start shooting in April of 2016. But then we actually started in May. I think it was like a month of rewrites and just kind of Zack going back and forth with the studio and stuff. So I've been involved in this whole process for a bit.
And do you remember what that initial runtime was for the first assembly?
I don't remember the exact, but it was over 4. I believe it was 4:30, maybe 4 around there.
I'm remembering that too, yeah.
It kind of looped the loop around a bit, this movie.
But if you know in the back of your mind that the studio will want a movie that's not over 2.5 hours, and then you're watching something that's well over 4 hours, you have your work cut out for you.
Well, you probably need a little help there. So Dody, it's apropos that I ask how you became a part of this project.
I interviewed with Zack for Army of the Dead and got that job, which was just a real joy and a pleasure. And then COVID happened. And while we were working on Army of the Dead, they were working on making the deal with Warner Brothers to do Zack Snyder's Justice League. And it just seemed sort of natural for me to slide over into Justice League. I don't even remember exactly if Zack asked me or if he told me. And David was already tied up on Avatar, and Carlos and I were already a well-oiled machine, and we could do that, especially because everything was remote. So there wasn't like switching to a new system or a new editing room or anything like that. And it just naturally evolved out of working on Army of the Dead.
So just one day you're working on Army of the Dead, and all of a sudden you notice the dailies start to change a little bit, and you're like, I didn't know Ben Affleck was in Army of the Dead.
Right. Well, I didn't start obviously with dailies. I had the magnificent work that David had done and that Carlos had been sort of carrying forward with Zack. So I sat down to a pretty well-formed assembly, more than an assembly, of Zack Snyder's Justice League. But there were a lot of details to nut out because we didn't have the VFX, and there was the decision about the aspect ratio, and then the decision about material to be added, whether it be from existing dailies or new material. And then we had a really tight schedule for that as well. So we had to, from starting to locking, I think we started in May and we were supposed to lock in September. And that was a soft lock because VFX and all of that changes. Plus we hadn't done the additional photography until October. So that kind of ginks you on the lock.
Is soft lock a new term?
Well, some people call it latched, but
Latched, I like that.
Yeah.
When you're working on a film that's destined to be released theatrically, there's a saying that you don't really finish, they just take it away from you. You know, you have a date you have to hit, and that's when the movie's going for the most part. But in this case, when you're releasing, you know, your destination is primarily HBO Max, did you have an actual end date to hit? Did you have a little more freedom to just be like, you know, we're going to work on this until this is ready to go? Or did you have in mind, like, we really need to get this wrapped up by a certain point?
The wrapping up by a certain point was driven, I mean, the tail wagging the dog is often in these kind of movies, VFX schedules. So we had to hit certain dates, and that doesn't mean there isn't wiggle room, but it's a difficult wiggle. It's there's pushback from various parties on not finishing because there's just only so much work can be done. And we're talking often, you know, months and months that need to be manifest from dailies to finish. So it's not something you can toy around with too much. And we did know roughly the date moved a few times, but we were pretty sure it was in March.
Because of the platform that it went out on and the ultimate runtime of 4 hours, was there ever any consideration to doing it as a series, just like you're seeing happen so often now on these platforms? Even taking into account that the Snyder Cut itself actually is broken into chapters and an epilogue and things like that. So was there ever a discussion about doing this as a series?
Absolutely. That was what we thought we were doing at the beginning, but for various contractual reasons, going into the weeds of which I couldn't even do if you asked me, we landed on it being one piece. That's the beauty of streaming. Anybody who wants to watch it in chapters or sections, or they have an appetite for an hour of the material, they can go back to it the next night. I know people who've watched it 2 or 3 times in a row without stopping. Hard to believe, but really true. And then I know other people who broke it up into 2 nights. And I think that the fact that it was streaming did allow for a lot of flexibility, both in fleshing out the characters and their backstories and not worrying, frankly, about runtime. It's the first project, I'll have to say legitimately, that I've not worried about runtime. I think if we had started knowing it was all one piece, we might have treated it differently. But by the time that decision came down, we had already gone down this road of really taking our time and really fleshing things out. So we didn't react to the one piece thing.
Yeah, I think that decision happened after our lock in September.
Right.
Or latched.
Yeah.
What was kind of interesting is from the beginning when we looked at the long assembly back in, when would that have been? Would that have been 2012?
No, 2017, you would have looked at the long assembly.
No, it would have been
The first time we looked at my assembly would have been 2012.
2016. That was when we got back from London.
Oh, 2016.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yes. Okay. So at that point, Zach said, you know what? We're going to do something different this time. We're going to put 3 categories in our mind. There's going to be an A cut, which is going to be everything that we like without consideration for running time. So we're just going to make the scenes the best that we can do. So in other words, he looked at a scene and maybe we questioned the performances, looked into dailies when he, said, is this the best time this happened? Or let's explore alternate cutting patterns. And that was the A cut. And then at the same time, knowing that we couldn't deliver a movie of any length, we worked on the B cut, which is like, okay, we're going to take this out. We're going to lift this line, maybe this little scene. There were not too many of those, but there were some. And then the C cut was like the extreme, like stuff if the studio would ever be like, we have to get this movie to some length that we're not happy with. These are going to be our ideas for extreme lifts that he's happy with. So during his editing, we kind of pursued all these 3, but as we got closer to his deadline, we sort of realized the B cut was what we had to put all of our eggs in because that's what we were going to show to the studio. So we would turn over to DJ, our visual effects supervisor, scenes and moments, shots from the B cut. And the B cut eventually became what we showed the studio, which was a cut that was about, was it 245, Carlos?
Yeah, I think the first one was 245, 230, and then it just kind of edged closer to. I think you guys got it down to like maybe 215.
But that was already Zach being unhappy.
Yeah.
Like I remember that the 245-ish cut was something that Zach was quite happy with. And we showed it to the studio. And then when we got the normal studio pressure, then he started to whittle down. And then he got towards that C cut thing and he started becoming unhappy. But it was a game that we had to play. We had only screened it for the studio and we never screened it for an audience. And there was this idea that we had to inject some humor into the first act of the film. And so that's when they interviewed some writers, and one of them was Joss Whedon. And then sometime around there is when the tragedy happened with Autumn. And it may have been before that. My timeline is a little bit hazy, but when Zach left the movie because he had no energy to fight, and he was going to be with his family, which is, he had to spend all his energy to do that. And Zach had already he had gone through a lot of fights with the studio before, which is very normal. But this was too much. The timing was too much. So he left and I said, what should I do? And he said, I think you should stay and be the best influence that you can be. And he said the same thing to DJ and to Tom Holkenberg, the composer. So I stayed and I said, what should I do? And we talked about it and we were like, remember the A cut? Let's work on the A cut. Let's go back to that. Let's try to update it. Let's try to smooth it out. Let's try to put the love that we put into the B cut and make that the best that we can be. So that's what I did for, I think it was something like a month or 6 weeks. And I think we called it something else, Carlos, like the ultimate cut or something like that. And
Yeah.
And that was more like 3 hours, a little more. So it was not what happened afterward. Afterward, they added more things. But that was that's where I left the project.
So hearing you talk about, ultimately what we have is the 2017 version that comes in around 2 hours, and you have Zack Snyder's cut around 4 hours. At the risk of misquoting somebody or remembering this wrong, I think it was somebody, Dody, that you worked with, Mike McCusker, who was talking to me about, you can get to a point where you can actually make the movie feel faster by adding more in. The audience is better informed. It's a smoother ride. And ultimately, when the movie's over, it feels quicker, even though it was longer. Is there a point where you get where it's like we're stripping stuff out, yet it feels longer? Whether you're speaking specific to Justice League or any film, is that a common phenomenon for an editor where you're just hacking away because you're being pressured to get the runtime down, yet it feels like a longer movie because there's less for the audience to follow?
Yeah, it's nice that you mentioned Mike McCusker. He was my assistant ages ago, but we've worked together a bunch of times also. And yeah, he's right. There are times it's sort of like, it's not killing your darlings to get it to be, mean and lean. It's actually sort of slitting open the jugular and letting all the blood flow out. And that's just not a pretty sight. And especially for the people who have known what was there. I think that there's also a saying that a movie is as long as it needs to be. And that when you try to squeeze something into a preconceived time, for time's sake, you are definitely going to risk losing some very important things. And the importance also, as you were saying, makes you feel more invested and more willing to give that time. So I think that's a really important aspect.
So one of the things about this project that fascinates me the most is sort of the forensic element of it, in that it's one thing for you to sit down and start a movie for the first time. It's also another for you to be an additional editor, to join a team and help out. But to go back and undo or redo or augment, like, I'm not even sure how you approach it. So I think that is my loaded question is, okay, when you knew that you were going to do this and go back and do Zach's version of the film, logistically, mechanically, however you want to put it, how do you actually go about doing that?
Well, in this particular case, Carlos and Zach had been keeping the version alive the whole time. So it wasn't as though you're opening up some creaky coffin with cobwebs on it. It was already there, ready to go. So it was COVID. We're working remotely anyway. So I had a proxy for a Justice League project that was in a warehouse in Burbank. But the actual hard drives and the living, breathing Avids that were running without monitors being on, they were somewhere else. So I had a proxy. Carlos had a proxy. We had an assistant who had a proxy. and Zack had a proxy, and the VFX editor had a proxy. So actually, two VFX editors had proxies, and that they're all through VPN. We were using TunnelBlick and then Jump Desktop through Atlas Runway. We were all logging into that same series of hard drives. And Carlos is probably going to be the better one to answer about how hard that was to get that up and running, because I sat down at my Avid and opened up bins and went to work.
How'd you do it, Carlos?
It was a full process, especially getting the whole Snyder Cut into one project, because it kind of lived. We had the studio, the official studio backup of the Nexus, and then there was this other hard drive with an additional cut on it that had different edits than what was in the studio version. So we just had to kind of meld them together. That was a whole nother thing that we had to deal with.
Well, the melding part does sound like the secret sauce of the whole thing.
Yeah, that's what made this entire process even possible, is the fact that we had this working version of the cut in Avid. It was an old version of Avid. I think it was Avid 7. I want to say is what we had. And so we just we made sure that whatever effects, and we had how many tracks? I think we had 24 tracks of audio, of packed audio, not stems, just built Avid tracks of just a lot of work that went into keeping it all together. And then we broke it down into reels, and then we started pulling threads on the sweater, and it's no, it's all going to unravel. But that was another fun process of keeping it all in one kind of cohesive project.
But it seems to me, Carlos, that what you were telling me, and Dody as well, that even though there was that A cut that I was talking about, you guys wanted to all even make it longer. Let's go back and even question stuff that was taken out from the beginning, right?
Yeah, I dove through, this was Zack and I kind of working through all of the cutscenes. I mean, we went through your initial assemblies, just putting together your dailies rolls. We went to daily rolls on some stuff and just rebuilt these scenes. And this is well before there was any idea of this actually seeing the light of day. This was just for Zack. The initial Snyder Cut was just meant for Zack to have a cut of the movie that he can show, that he can watch and he can show his friends. That's literally all it was.
So by the time Dody came on, it was probably, it was longer. There was more in there than when I had left, right?
It was 3.5 hours.
It was, we were at 3:37 or something.
So you guys probably added about 20 minutes or a little more, because I'm remembering a 3 hour or maybe a little over that. So that's cool.
Well, also, by the time I was sitting with anything, any shred of anything that had been done by Joss Whedon had been taken out. There was not a single frame of image, no added dialogue, nothing from Joss. So it was all from the original shoot, and there was nothing else.
But I'm surprised it got in there anyway, because the A cut that we left, that was before anything by Joss was shot.
Yeah, what we ended up doing was using some of the Joss finished visual effects to kind of augment our cut, just so that we wouldn't have green screen.
Right.
And that's what the initial Snyder Cut was. And that's actually why the Snyder Cut was framed in 1/6.6 and was black and white. He didn't want it to be 1/8.5 because he didn't want it to look like the theatrical version. And we couldn't go the full 4:3 or the full 1:3:3 because we didn't have those visual effects. We were stuck to 1/8.5. So then 1/6.6 was the kind of happy medium, and then putting everything in black and white just helped us with
visual effects.
Cyborg's suit, which was just pajamas. I mean, it was, Ray Fisher was in pajamas the whole time.
I remember he told me that we were on the phone, and he said, remember we had talked about the square format, the 1/6.6. He's like, I'm going to do that, and I'm going to do this in black and white, because a lot of the temp effects that we had are going to look a lot better. And Stefan, who's his color timer at Company 3, will have an easier time making it look cool. That's before he knew that he'd be able to have this released and they'd be able to finish them properly, right?
Yeah.
But I remember he was talking about one of the reasons he liked the format was because superheroes, their bodies are part of their power. And so we looked at these shots of Wonder Woman, Batman, and Superman, and we looked at them in CinemaScope format, and we looked at them in this format, and there was something about them that was epic, and their height, or the characters in the history story, where you have Zeus, and you have the leaders of the Atlanteans, the kings. Something about them in this format showed their bodies.
So I think I had read Zack say that his cut he was 80% of where he wanted to be when he left the project. Is that pretty much the case, Carlos, when you were doing this reclamation part of it with him? Was it 80% of the way there? Or now that, having finished the film, is there less than 80% of what he had in there today? If you can even understand how I phrased that question, bonus points to you.
Well, meaning because when he left the project, that was not 80% of what he wanted. Because very much at the time that Zack left the project, it was already compromised, and from shooting it was compromised. It wasn't what he initially wanted to shoot. But I think when we finished his Snyder cut, I'd say it's probably closer to 80 or 90% because the cut didn't change much from that point. It was his cut, and then all the visual effects came in, and obviously that dictated whether we could change things now, because a lot of times he wanted to change certain scenes, but he couldn't because we couldn't fix the visual effects behind it, or we couldn't. So then now that we could do that, that's when he and Dody just kind of went through and with DJ and just kind of put everything, kind of upended all the action stuff and fixed a lot of big action issues he had early on.
And it seems to me, I'm going to hand this to you, Dody, but in terms of visual effect shots, it's not always just like, oh, we're going to replace the shot. It's storytelling. So there was a backstory to Cyborg. There was a fantasy sequence that I believe was cut out of the other version. And since we didn't have visual effects, I was just kind of putting it together in what I had. But then when you guys realized that you could actually make this, Dody took that over and kind of started from scratch using the storyboards. Is that right, Dody?
Yeah, you're talking about the scene in the bank where he goes in and he follows the story of the woman who loses her apartment and has the kids and all of that. Yeah, that was from dailies. I did that from dailies. So I don't know. I did a lot of digging into your bins, but in that particular case, that was from dailies. I could pretty much pinpoint every area that I worked on. And as I said, we didn't have that much time. So Zack was very specific, the areas he wanted to work on. And there were plenty of areas that I never even touched a frame. I mean, obviously, one of my favorites, the scene with Iris, the slow motion car crash, fabulous scene. I didn't touch a frame and wouldn't even dream of it. It's so amazing. I love it.
Yeah, that was, I remember they were trying to figure out, should we change the music? Should we make it something more upbeat? But I had put that piece of music in, but you guys found a great cover for that song.
Well, that's actually, it's a singer that came in. They were auditioning lots and lots of singers, and she was one of the people that provided a cover as an audition, and she was picked, and then they re-recorded it at air.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, Dody, I love the work you did at the end. Really love, like, the new stuff that was shot. Suddenly, I'm a kid watching this awesome superhero movie, and I just love your style, and I love what you did.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. But it was because, again, of COVID, and because Zack and I already knew each other, the way we were working was really odd, because we would sit down together with these already formed reels. The first big decision we had to make, honestly, was the format, aspect ratio. And there was a lot of discussion, and I'll just call it painful hand-wringing over whether we could actually go 1:3:3. And Zack and I did a bunch of comparisons and looked at the framing of original shots that hadn't been turned into VFX yet. And exactly what David said. I remember distinctly looking at the shot of Wonder Woman after she picks up the arrow and the big columns are next to her, and it's like legs from here to eternity. And it's such a beautifully framed shot in 1:3:3. And we were looking at that and we're just like going, it has to be 1:3:3. It has to be. And we had nicknamed the project 166. I mean, that happened before I came on. It was always 166. We just kept calling it 166, but we knew we had to go 1:3:3. And then there was all this horse trading that we had to do with visual effects with DJ and Tamara Kent, the VFX producer. as to which shots could they redo and extend the upper, the top and bottom to get it to be full 133. And that was a pretty big process in and of itself in terms of looking at that and how it affected the cut. And then we went through each section of the film and we would watch, and then we would stop. So he's watching at his house, I'm watching at my house, my editing room, and he's seeing my timeline and my screen. And we would stop and he would talk about it and tell me things that he wanted to explore. And then I would go off on my own and explore them and bring options back. And we would work through the whole film that way. And like I said, just certain sections.
Do you recall certain things that Zack, when you say things he wanted to explore in terms of story, are there any key points that stand out to you as something where he said, I'm not sure what to do here. Can you go do a little investigative work and see what you can come up with?
Well, yeah, all of the action scenes, we looked at them pretty closely because we knew that we could change things, especially early on. Like David was saying, anything that was unclear story-wise, and we knew that any shot that was Steppenwolf was going to be redone. So if there was something that could be inserted in to make it clearer, more exciting, more action, we did that. And I have to admit that Zack and DJ have worked together, DJ DeJarnette have worked together quite a bit, and they're like twins who have their own little secret language, and they would get on these kind of Zoom calls where they would just be firing things back and forth at each other. And then I'd call Zack and say, did he say this? Or did you guys mean that? And I would have to get it sorted out so that I could then manifest it in the cut, because they were just spitballing. And so lots of things came through that way, or it came through with us, like rearranging shots. And the bank brawl, which is actually Old Bailey with Wonder Woman who's standing on the Justice statue and then she saves the kids from the terrorists. That we refined, and a lot of that had to do with changing the speed of how she moved. That just affected the cut in so many different ways. Plus, we were unfettered. We were able to add blood, for example, kind of make it a little more realistic and less comic booky, if that's the right word. So there was all through the Atlantean scenes, there were tweaks and little things. There was a scene that he wanted me to work on, which was when Hippolyte is trying to rescue the woman I know as Sam Joe, who's caught under the horse. And I did, but the VFX people talked us out of it. We couldn't do it because it was just too hard to rotoscope her hair and whatever, things like that. I reworked a little bit the Martha Lois scene. We added in the Alfred Diana Prince tea scene. I reworked some bits of the Alfred scene in the warehouse with Bruce, where he talks about, if you can't bring down the charging bull, don't wave the red cape at it. We reworked the tunnel battle quite a bit. Again, probably was based on what VFX were available at the time. We reworked a lot of the Russian melee, but there was tons. The Russian melee is so long, that's the battle at the end, that I'm not saying there aren't large swaths that were, that maintained. Also the scene in the bar with Aquaman when he saves the guy on the boat, just kind of tweaked that around a little bit. So it's that kind of thing. But I mean, it's 4 hours. There's no way that I could have, or would have wanted to, by the way, but no way so I really had to be targeted based on what Zack asked for.
On a regular project, organization is everything for an editor. If you're not organized, it makes it that much harder to be creative, to get into the flow and tell a great story. Here, it feels like you're having to keep track of so many different elements. I mean, do you have specific methods, tools, best practices, whatever that you use to keep track of all these things so you do understand the difference between these different versions?
I don't care about the difference between the two versions at all. All I cared about was manifesting Zack's vision, and we had already done all of that hard work. I mean, Carlos had done it, really, or David had done it to make sure that it was all Zack's material in the first place. So that was a big thing. And then I never referred to the other version. Never. Not a single time did I open the other version, which I had in my bins. No, I didn't. And I went to dailies, and then I looked at David's assembly and first cuts and worked with that, and then was working with Zack's memory, which he has an amazing memory, for one thing. That's really fantastic to work with someone like that. But in terms of keeping track, it's just, yes, the breadth of it was so wide. I use notepads and Post-its and just write things down and cross them off, write them down, cross them off. And we were meeting with visual effects sometimes every day of the week. And those were pretty exhaustive meetings as well.
Some days twice a day.
That's true, yeah.
Or we'd have a 6 a.m. session and then
Right.
a 2 p.m. session.
Well, so before we walk away from the VFX part of this, whether you're working as an assistant or a lead editor on a VFX film like this, is what's being asked of assistants different because of just the nature of this type of project? If you were doing a sort of straight ahead narrative drama, rom-com, whatever, is the assistant's role appreciably different than it is on a huge VFX heavy film?
Not really, not that different. It's just things are a little more complicated. There's a little more plates for you to spin, so to speak. Like you just have to be in contact with the visual effects department more. What shots are we going to get in? But for the most part, it's become easy. I've kind of, in the last maybe 10, 15 years, I've only worked on these giant VFX movies. So it's the only, in a way, it's the only world that I know to live in. So for me, it's just like, well, these moving parts are going, and then at the end, they'll come together, and it always works.
Having a good VFX editor is really important, and one that understands your process. Because when you're doing what I was talking about, you're creating initially, or you're helping to create the skeleton for what's going to be the visual effects of the film. Now, the way Zack works, he and DJ have created a system that goes way back to the first 300, which is Zack draws everything that's in his mind. He'll make a book of all the frames of the movie. Now, it won't be shot by shot in editing order, although sometimes it will be. And I'm sure if you looked at the opening of Watchmen, that is cut for cut the same. And a lot of sequences are. Other times it's just this frame, and these are the shots that he wants to do. But so that book will go to DJ, and he'll work with his previs artists to create previous versions of that using the script to know, okay, this is what has to happen. And then if there's a stunt in it, he will take that to his stunt supervisor, Damon Caro, who is just as keyed in with Zack as DJ. Like the three of them are just like Dody was saying, they have their own language. And he will do stunt viz, which is a term I never heard before. But in other words, it's previs that's kind of comped with the actual stunts, and they do their own speed ramps, and they just act them out in a warehouse. One of the stunt people will be Wonder Woman, one of the stunt people will be Batman, Steppenwolf, etc. We'll bring that all into the Avid. We'll bring the storyboards, we'll bring the previs and the stunt viz. And then when you're cutting the scene together, those are your tools. But then you come up with kind of like, okay, here's the scene. You go over it with Zack a couple times, and now it's all in one package. And that becomes kind of the skeleton for DJ to say, okay, let us take this to Weta or whatever they're using.
So if an editor is going to have a career of any kind of real length, they're going to be let go from a project. They're going to join a project. It's just the nature of the business. When, what made me think of this, Dody, is you talked about opening up David's bins and seeing his work. Can you actually learn something about the way he edits or his style just from looking at his cuts or the way he organizes things?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, absolutely. And Carlos knows this about me, and I really appreciated it about David, that I like my bins to be absolutely clear and full of information that if I were to get hit by a truck, another editor could come in and take over. Because it happens, and I just am not one of those people who wants to kind of hide what I'm doing. And the teams have become bigger, and there's more sharing and crossover. It's really important, and labeling and consistency in labeling and all of that. It's really a fantastic thing. And David's work was like that. I was able to go into the bins, see how you put things together. I mean, it was really, like I said, I was standing on the shoulders of giants there. It's really beautiful stuff.
And so when these situations do arise where you're joining a project or leaving a project, and again, every film is unique, the reasons for why these things happen are unique, is there a process you follow where you're going to reach out to the editor that left the project or is coming onto the project, do sort of a handoff, or is it generally a better idea to just, walk away?
David and I didn't talk until after the project was finished. I think Carlos and David talked a few times, and I'm pretty sure Zack and David talked a few times. I was actually pretty busy. I didn't have time to call, and I knew he was busy. And also I was working with the director, so I didn't really need any of that input. And Carlos and Zack had really advanced further from the ultimate cut. So I was just picking up where they had dropped off.
And I think what can be difficult on other projects, not this one, is that whether a director kind of like loses power or whether a director changes editing teams or what have you, sometimes what happens is the communication between editors is non-existent because there's hurt feelings, there's egos, there's like different teams that happen. And so that they don't talk. Now, this movie was none of that. We're all friends and we're all putting our best into this project that developed over years. But it is difficult sometimes when you leave a project or you take over a project and you know the other editor. It can be definitely a tender thing.
So we haven't talked about sound yet, and we absolutely should, because that is an important element of this as anything. You know, Carlos, you said there was a cut that was always sort of alive and that you were working on with Zack. When it came time to look at the audio and the music and the sound effects, what was the sort of the battle plan for changing that out? Were there things that were always in the back of Zack's mind, like, okay, this is the first thing I want to do is I want to make sure I get this in or get this out?
We didn't attack it in a separate way. We kind of, we had worked with the same sound team on the previous movies, so that we already had the shorthand with them. And they had, this is Scott Hecker and his team, they had the theatrical version to kind of build off of already. So it was just a matter of beefing up some of the 2017 sound effects that were already in place. Like there's some stuff that Zack heard that he said, you know what, that's cool, but for my version, I want it to sound different. He wanted certain things to look and sound different. So we just kept my audio tracks through the whole run. And it was, you know, like I said, it's 24 tracks. It was a lot of some stems. We use stems from Autumn Frost, which is Man of Steel. So we use stems from Man of Steel. We use stems from 300. We use stems from Army of the Dead. We had some really nice desert wind that I was like, hey, come over here and play with us in this world, please. So it was literally just, luckily, Scott Hecker and his team were able to make sense of those audio tracks because they really got the short end of the stick. They had zero time. I think in the initial post schedule, they were going to have somewhere around 9 months. And I think in actuality, they had maybe 5, I think. I'm not sure. But it was a huge task just keeping everybody. And we were reviving old cuts with them. So a lot of what we were doing in the background is we were pulling versions that we had turned over with David, reviving those versions so that the sound crew can do a conform from that version to this current version, and also creating an intermediate with the theatrical version just so they can go in the different directions and pull what they need to. So that whole process was challenging.
Carlos, I don't remember. Did we ever turn over a version to Scott? Did we ever temp with Scott?
We did. We did the initial. Yeah, we did a small mix, but the mix wasn't very. It wasn't very good. It was a mix of Avid tracks, so everything sounded even, but it wasn't anything that Zack wanted to work with. So that's why it was stems from the theatrical cut, just for like the mother box sounds or explosions and fireballs, and which just sound better, you know, being processed. So we just had to. The sound guys had to strip all that away and revive it in a way that makes the most sense, because they couldn't start from scratch because it was 4 hours of a lot. 4 hours of a lot. I guess there's no other way to say that.
Did they have time to like dialogue pre-dub?
Yeah, they did. Luckily, a lot of that work was done for the theatrical, just making stuff clear. And we actually have there was an ADR line that our mixer accidentally cut in. He was having a hard time understanding what Amy Adams said when they land in the field, when she lands with Superman in the field. And he looked for ADR. He didn't ask anybody. He just pulled up some ADR that was there. And she said, "You smell good," which is a holdover from the theatrical. And so we're in the final mix and we're watching this scene, and all of a sudden it's like, and by saying we're in the final mix means I'm home watching the final mix on my TV. And I think Zack and Dody were in the room, or they may have been in separate rooms. I'm not sure how everything was laid out, but we hear this, you know, "You smell good." And we're like, wait a minute, what's that? Where that? And I think Zack didn't even pick it up. Debbie, his wife, is the one that noticed it. And we played it back 2 or 3 times, and a lot of people were like, what's the problem? And it's like, she shouldn't say that. It doesn't matter how he smells.
You spoke. That's what the line is.
Yeah.
He says, did I not before?
Right.
Yeah. And it got changed to "you smell good," and then he asked, "Did I not before?" for the theatrical.
Good catch.
Yeah.
Well, this is a topic I've been bringing up a lot with picture editors lately, and that's the topic of doing sound in picture editorial. Dody, I'll start with you because I know a big part of your career early on was doing sound editing. So as an editor, do you feel like you do a lot of sound editing, a lot of temp sound work? Do you like to do a lot of sound work in picture, or do you tend to like to leave that to the sound team?
Well, I like to do it, but frankly, I have been leaving that more and more to not necessarily the sound team, but to the assistants. And hearing this conversation reminded me that one of the big things that we worked on and earliest on were all of the scenes with Steppenwolf, Desaad, and Darkseid, because we added dialogue. We would go with very, very crude previs without any mouth moving or even any particular camera angles, and cut things together. And Zack would spitball lines and we'd write them down. And then Carlos or Zack would record them, Avid audio, editing room audio. And we finesse those scenes with that new dialogue. And then that would go to VFX. And then we also had to record the audio remotely with those actors in order for them to actually refine and finish the visual effects because they had lip sync. So that was a fun and challenging process. Again, everything remote. And in terms of the sound on this film, the Avid tracks were insanely good. They were so good. And I don't know who was responsible for those. I mean, you and Carlos, you and David, who did all of that, because the sound effects were already great when I sat down with the cut.
What I would do is I would cut a scene and give it to Warren Paff, who was the first assistant at the time. And he would just, sometimes they were flatline. There was nothing, there was no sound at all. Other times there was some stuff. And then he would give a pass to me. And then I would add stuff, give him some notes, mix it. And then we would show it to Zack for the first time. And then, and then as we just edited on, we would add stuff and just refine it. So Warren actually did a lot of this.
The one thing I did want to know, David, on your first viewing of this new cut, was there anything in particular that stood out to you that you said, oh, I'm so glad they're able to do that or fix that or change that or put that back? Was there anything in that initial viewing where you're just like, yeah, that's what I wanted to see?
I would just say the whole film, the whole vision it was very emotional for me, because what happened to the film was what happened to the film, and seeing what he really wanted to have it be, seeing his vision as a whole really was amazing to me. And I was proud of it. I was proud for Zack. I was proud for you, Dody, and you, Carlos, and happy that the fans had helped get this to happen. Happy that HBO Max had given him this opportunity to tell the story and see his vision. I don't think anything like this has ever happened before. So it was a holistic thing for me.
Yeah, there's no question this has never happened before. And the three of you came together collectively in different stages to pull off this pretty incredible feat. I guess the only thing left that I would ask Dody is, which is more complicated, cutting Memento for Christopher Nolan or redoing the Zack Snyder cut?
Both wonderful experiences. You can't compare. That's like saying, who's your favorite child,
That's funny. My parents never had a problem with that question. I'll let you infer how they answered it. I hope you enjoyed that behind-the-scenes look at one of the most discussed and anticipated recuts probably ever. I will do what I can to talk Dody and Carlos into coming back when Army of the Dead comes out. I think that one will be a ton of fun. And I would love to talk to David again, if not just to discuss Avatar 2, but also the amazing work he's already done in his career. If you enjoyed today's show and all the hard work that went into it, you could pay me back a few ways. First, make sure you are subscribed to the podcast as well as the companion YouTube channel so you don't miss anything. It doesn't mean you have to listen to or watch everything I post, but at least I know that you had the opportunity. Plus, I'll make it super easy and put a couple of links in the show notes to help you do that. And second, if you haven't tried the latest and greatest version of Avid Media Composer, either because you're on an older version or you use something else to edit, just download the trial and test it out. And with that, our time together has come to an end, but just for now. Until we meet again, this is your friend Matt Fury thanking you for joining me right here on The Rough Cut.